So here we go. What we got to cover today is the remainder of this access and security lecture. And after that, I will have a few words to say about the exam. But first, remember, this exam, for this one, because, the strike and I had to rush through some stuff and blah, 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 all that, and who knows what's going on with the rest of your courses. This exam, if you do badly on it, I will replace it with the average of your other 3 exam scores. So there's that, which is, again, not an invitation to, not study at all for the exam because, if nothing else, this is good practice, but just, to generally not panic. And for most of you, it probably won't make much difference because, students do tend to perform similarly across exams throughout the semester. But, just in case this has been some kind of hardship for you this first few weeks, I'll give you that. Okay. So let's get on with the lecture then. Get away. Okay. So we're going to cover a bunch of types of security threats. And then we'll mention a couple of Facebook security breaches, and then attributes of attackers and good defenders. So, first kind of attack is what's called a brute force attack. Now, in computer science, a brute force algorithm is an algorithm that considers every single possibility out there. So, for example, if you had a brute force chess application, it would search so many moves or plies, which they call them, so many plies deep in the possibilities going forward, but it would search every one of them and evaluate the possibilities, right? So similar thing for brute force password hacking. The bad guys are going to try every possible valid combination of characters for that password. Now, the thing about a brute force attack is given enough time and resources, yes, it will eventually work. But eventually could be a really, 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 really long time. And in fact, the costs in terms of hardware and electricity required to guess the password would almost certainly be much greater than any benefit you could get from stealing the information. So, practical solutions to brute force attacks. Number 1, strong passwords composed of, random combinations of letters and numbers and special characters and, fairly long strings of them. And number 2, enforce delays or account locking after a few failed attempts. Okay, so in a well-designed system, the brute force attack is not a severe threat. Once upon a time it was. If any of you, in the unlikely event, any of you have seen the, I think it was from 1983, the movie War Games, there's some bored teenager who hacks into a Pentagon system because it's protected by a 4-digit PIN code. And he just has his computer cycle through all the possibilities in a minute or so, and whoop, eventually he gets in. Of course, that sort of thing is no longer possible in a well-designed system. Okay, now, guessing a password does seem like an impossible task given what we've talked about frequent requirements for password construction. But yeah, it does happen, right? So passwords including personal data like names or birthdays of spouse, children's pets, that sort of thing. Or passwords including common words that are vulnerable to dictionary attacks, right? So yeah, in a well-designed system, the password requirements would be such that that's not possible. But again, not every system requires that. But it is certainly possible to steal passwords in a variety of ways. Number 1, intercepted wireless data. So for example, if you text or email somebody your password, a lot of times those messages are sent out without encryption. And somebody might be listening in and say, oh, you're sending out your account credentials. Hey, I can use that. Other things, keystroke logging on public machines. There is a devious, sneaky, espionage type hardware out there called keystroke loggers that you can attach to somebody's keyboard, and they'll track all the keys that somebody presses, right? That stuff exists. Of course, malware. If your computer is infected with some sort of malware, there's the possibility that they might be able to lift any locally stored passwords from your browser. And of course, obtaining identical passwords from insecure sites. Use the same password on many places. That's a way to steal it. And of course, phishing. So, has anyone here never heard of phishing? Really? Wow, okay, cool. Nobody volunteered that in my afternoon. Well, good. Well, you're going to learn today. That's great. Okay, so phishing is one of the most popular and successful methods for stealing access credentials. What it is is basically the bad guys trick you into giving up your password. So the history of all this, once upon a time, right, like 40 years ago, it might have been possible to do a brute force attack on a fair number of password protected systems. Eventually that became impossible, but people were still using things like words and simple sequences of numbers and text, and it was surprisingly easy to often guess them. Well, eventually the websites wised up and said, nope, we can't do that anymore. So we're going to make the passwords really, really hard to guess. So the bad guy said, yeah, okay, fine. We can't guess anymore, right? It's just not going to be a viable approach. But we can try to send a nice looking email to somebody and tell them that their account is in danger and they have to, give us their information so we can, verify that their information is safe for something. So typical attack method, you'll get some email from somebody that you don't know saying that some problem requires immediately logging into their site, right? They'll include a link there. Please log into our secure server so we can, help keep your account safe. And then the email reader visits the site, types in their ID and password, and boom, they've given away the keys, right? Then the bad guys have them. Or in some cases, phishing will send an email with a malware attachment that basically does the same thing. It has some executable file or some kind of infected PDF document, something like that, that again lifts those access credentials somehow. Now, what we've talked about as far as the bad guys who are selling these passwords, right? They're not, in most cases, they're not looking for your passwords individually, right? They're looking to get a batch of account credentials that then they can sell in a batch to some other bad guys. So what that means is this change, you're not going to be immediately at risk if they steal your password, right? There's going to be a little while where they're gathering up other passwords and take time to sell them. So for that, preserving the illusion of legitimacy is vital. It means you don't want, after you've fooled somebody into giving up their credentials, you don't want them thinking, hey, wait a minute, that setup sounded kind of sketchy. I don't know. I'm going to change my password. That whole thing seems bogus, right? So in order to do that, phishers typically do things like use a phony but plausible email source address, right? I mean, they're not going to say badguy@hacker.net if that's their actual email. They're going to do, something, right? Or they might use a phony site with a similar URL to a valid site. Things like replacing L's with I's or L's with, number ones, things like that. Reordering or merge terms. So whereas target.com is a legit site for Target and help.target.com would be part of Target's site, targethelp.com is a completely unaffiliated site. But if they say, log into our secure server at targethelp.com with your Target ID and your Target password and we'll help you, yeah, that. Although the people that you register URLs with, domain registration, they're a lot fussier about things that are close to major business names these days. And of course, at the end, the biggest trick of all, after you go to their site and you give them your ID and password, what they'll probably do is something like, please accept our updated password. Here's the one we recommend for you. Or they'll have a below screen. They say, here, enter in your new password here. And then they'll redirect you back to the site that you were supposed to go to, right? So you update your password on targethelp.com and they say, thank you. Now we're going to log you into target.com because we want you to keep shopping. But then they still have your keys, right? Because you typed in the new password. All right. Now, again, sometimes this happens with in real life. I mean, we all see these kind of spam phishing emails in our email box. I remember about 15 years ago, my mom, who was close to 80 at the time, she called me up one morning in a bit of a panic, and she said, Doug, I have a big problem. And I said, okay, Mom, what is it? And she says, I just got this email from Bank of America. And I said, okay. They said, it says my account may have been hacked. And I said, okay. And she said, they want me to, log into my account and change my password. And I said, okay, because I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. And she finally says, but I don't have a Bank of America account. And I said, Mom, this is what's called phishing. This is a scam. This is what yeah. But anyway, many of you may have old grandparents and you'll have to field these similar calls one day yourself. Anyway, okay. And again, my mom wasn't by any means computer illiterate. She'd been using email for decades and stuff at work, but I don't know, that one surprised her. Okay, now another thing that the phishers will often do is something called spoofing. So spoofing is intentionally misrepresenting a name, like an internet address, website name, or an email address. Now, spoofing is not inherently a bad thing. In many cases, it's useful. So I'm going to drop into this. Hold on, what am I thinking? Online HTML editor. Okay, we'll do the W3 schools one. That's fine. Okay, so this one we're going to go. Okay, so what I can do, this is HTML. This is basically web page code. So the code I enter in on the left, the source code, will appear as a web page on the right. So I'm going to do a hyperlink. So A is the tag for a hyperlink, and the href is the hyperlink reference where the link points to. So I'm going to do https www.uic.edu. Okay, and here I can just put that in here. And when I run this, the link will appear and I can click on it. And hey, it takes me to UIC. How about that? Okay. But if I wanted to, I could put some different text to show along with the link, right? I could put in something like, jump ahead with your education, right? Here I'm being a propagandist for UIC, but they do sign my paychecks. So I could click on that, right? But the point is, you can have a more interesting label on your link. They're not trying to fool anybody. So spoofing is not inherently a malicious thing, right? It's just you can attach a different appearance onto something than it actually directs to. Of course, like a lot of things that aren't designed to be evil, they can be used for evil. Spoofing is one of those things. So, phishing naturally uses this kind of spoofing to get people to open and trust the email message, right? If you, for example, said, you got this email from something and you open it up and, the actual link goes to, steal your bank or criminal syndicate at bulgaria.net, something like that. There was a window where there was a lot of Bulgarian malware activity. That may have passed by now. Anyway, right? You're not going to click on that. You're like, nope. But if it says help at targethelp.com, yeah, maybe. Okay. Now, nice thing about phishing, in many cases, they're really obvious. You look at the phishing email and you're like, nope, they didn't. This is not very professional. This is not very official. I don't think this is real. Also, hovering cursor over a link should cause a pop-up of the actual link destination, right? That's like a standard thing in web browsers and email applications these days. It wasn't always though. So if I hover over this, you can see down in the left corner there, it says https www.uic.edu. So I can see where the link goes. All right, so that's a feature that's built into email these days. Wasn't always there. All right. Now the last bit associated with phishing, I guess it's second to last, is spear phishing. In most cases, the bad guys that are doing phishing aren't targeting you in particular, right? They're sending out like 1 million phishing attempts in the hope of gathering a few hundred or a few thousand hits. Okay, that's what they're really hoping for. So they don't really care whose accounts they get. But more important people, right, may be targeted as small groups or even individually. And the classic case of that recently was Sony. So you guys may remember circa 2015, North Korea was pretty upset that Sony was coming out with the movie called The Interview with Seth Rogen and James Franco as two interviewers who were actually I think CIA agents sent out to assassinate Kim Jong-un. So anyway, North Korea wasn't real thrilled about this movie and they wanted Sony to not release it. And Sony said, nah, we're going to release it. And so what these guys did, North Korea targeted Sony, right, in order to try to keep them from releasing the film. So that's the difference. Spear phishing is targeting particular individuals, right? Ordinary phishing, yeah, it's think of like a big trawler out in the ocean throwing out some net. They catch a bunch of fish. They don't really care if they catch Charlie the tuna or Fred the tuna. They just want to catch a tuna, right? Spear phishing, they're really after Charlie the tuna for whatever reason. I don't know what he did. They're after him though. Okay. Now, the way this often works, spear phishing, sometimes they target you directly, sure, but in many cases, they do what's called a multi-stage attack. So a multi-stage attack is a way of having, especially spear phishing, seem more credible. So If you get this kind of phishing email and it looks like junky and whatever, then you're just going to ignore it if you even open it, right? But if it's labeled as being, say, from UIC security team, which you know is a real thing because you've been trained and you've been told that UIC security team is a real thing, you're probably going to open it. But what if the security team themselves have been compromised, right? So that is the problem. So in a multi-stage attack, typical way it goes is you get some credentials of actual security employees within the organization. You use those credentials to send out, very legitimate seeming emails to all the people in the organization that you want to target. And then eventually, once you've gotten all the data you want to get, you exfiltrate it. Basically means you grab it and you run for the exit with it. And in the case of Sony, this is what they did, right? So they targeted Sony's security people. They had those accounts send, notifications to senior executives saying, oh, it's time for you to renew your password. Please log into our secure system to do so and keep your account safe. Then when they did that, or, when their personal assistants did it, whatever, then the bad guys had access to their entire email account. So they'd come in and check in at like 4 in the morning or something when there wasn't much going on, and they'd download great big batches of data, and they'd send them to file sharing services that would echo it to other file sharing services that would keep on echoing it to new ones until it was virtually untraceable, right? I mean, everybody kind of figures it's North Korea, but, it hasn't been conclusively proven beyond all doubt. But, yeah. Anyway, so that's the way a multi-stage attack would typically happen. Okay. Another kind of attack is the denial of service attack. So a denial of service attack, you're basically trying to overload a system with network connection attempts. It's like everybody in the world is trying to place a phone call to the same destination number at the same time, right? They're not all going to get through. Does anybody ever try to do one of those radio calls where they say like the 9th person to call gets free tickets to something or other? Line's always busy. Anybody ever win one of those? You win? No? Anybody? I knew a person who, when it was back in the 80s, it was to some band called The Power Station, which he was absolutely not a fan of. And so he said to him, oh, you keep the tickets. I don't want them. Anyway, but I was like, damn, you won something. Wow. All right. Anyway, whatever. That was the 80s. It was a different time. So in a denial of service attack, they attempt to overload the network, right, with too many connection requests. Now, if it's just from one source, right, if it's just from one machine trying to ping the system like 10,000 times a second, it's pretty easy for the network to spot that and say, oh, we're not going to listen to you anymore, and they're going to block that particular device, and then the problem's kind of solved. So because of that, the next step in the arms race is to create what's called a distributed denial of service attack. And a distributed denial of service attack basically takes tens of thousands or even millions of compromised machines and basically hijacks their operation to have them all attempt to call into the network, some system at the same time. And because there are so many different calls coming in from so many different sources, and you're not sure which are legitimate ones just trying to retry and which ones are trying to do it 10,000 times a second, right? Because most of the connection attempts aren't really getting through. It's a lot harder, takes a lot longer to filter out all those addresses, right? Eventually, the system administrators can do that. They can come up with a list of, oh, here are all the bad machines that are messing with our system, but it's going to take some time. And a distributed denial of service attack, there's not really any way to stop it. There just is, short of shutting down the system, right? So what it is it's going to wreck your day. It's maybe going to wreck your weekend. But eventually it can be solved. So what it is a temporary but potentially severe disruption. All right. Another kind of attack is a SQL injection. So SQL, remember, is the language of databases. So in a SQL injection attack, what the bad guys are doing are trying to change how the password checking process works. So if we had a little more time, I'd talk more in detail about this, but we want to get this done. So the brief version is, normally if you log into a system, you give it your ID, you give it your password, it runs a query through the database that says, find the record where this ID is, and then check if the password that the user gave matches what's stored in the database. And if it does, it returns back the access credentials. Well, in a SQL injection attack, basically you include some extra code to fool the matching operation. So in this means basically select star, that get all the matches from some table users where the name matches the name, and the password, either, here's the part that gets changed, this is an empty string, so either the password is blank or the character 1 is equal to the character 1. So they've tampered with this process so that this, instead of just checking the password match, checks if either of those conditions are true. And even though this is probably always going to be false, this is definitely always going to be true, meaning you will automatically get the login credentials for whoever's name you included. Okay, now back in the 90s, this was potentially dangerous. A lot of systems hadn't figured out that this was a thing. But now we have, for this kind of database operation, basically what are called structured statements. So you would set up your query to say, I expect to find a query with only 2 matching conditions. And if somehow the query ends up having 3 matching conditions, name is name and password, or some kind of compound statement like that that you didn't include in the expected structure, it'll reject it. It'll say, nope, this doesn't meet the format we expected, so we know what you're trying to do. We're not going to fall for it this time. Okay? So that's a SQL injection attack, is basically where you try to change the structure of the database check by including some executable SQL code in the password block. Okay. Last one of these attack models, cross-site scripting. So the standard way that cross-sites, there are a bunch of different cross-site scripting attack models. It's kind of an interesting topic. I shouldn't even say kind of interesting. It's just interesting. But the basic way to do it is where you put some script code, some active code on a page that was not supposed to be there. So, for example, suppose you post something on Facebook, like a picture of you on vacation at the beach, and one of your friends writes down below, oh, weather looks great. And another friend looks like, oh, wow, I wish I was there. And another friend posts down below that, writes in a script inside an HTML script tag, which contains some active code and, does some bad stuff on your machine. Now, if the website that you do that to is alert to the danger, they're not going to allow that script to actually be executable. But if the website is not alert to the danger, then that script tag that gets embedded in that other part is actually going to be executed whenever anyone sees the page, you, your friends, anybody else. Another way this was commonly, and depending on, what people are trying to do with that, it could be very, very bad or mildly bad. So one of the classic ways that people were doing this was on online dating sites like Match.com. So in the profile, where there wasn't supposed to be any script, people would include some script code. So when the page displayed, the script also displayed part of the page and executed. And what it would often do is lift people's emails, right? It would try to find out what their email was. It somehow was able to do that and pulled their emails. And then the bad guys would have this list of emails of people that they knew kind of what their type was, and they knew, that they were interested and available. So, they could set up some other phony thing and send them an email saying, hi, I saw your profile. We should go out, but I can't meet in person because I'm stuck overseas. Can you send me $500 for my plane ticket? Right? Stuff like that. So anyway, there's other models for cross-site scripting, but basically a script someplace where it shouldn't be, executing in a way it shouldn't. The whole term cross-site scripting basically means normally scripts have to be created and put in place on the pages by the website itself. Cross-site scripting means there's somehow a script that arrived from some other place, not from the website itself. It shouldn't be there. Okay, that's why it's called cross-site scripting. Okay. Now, we have some stuff about Facebook. All right. But as a rule of thumb, here's something to think about, right? Popular sites, popular software tend to draw most of the bad activity, right? I mean, why would you bother putting a lot of effort into, some blog that only like 10 people go see in a given year, right? But Facebook is busy. If you can find a vulnerability on Facebook, you can potentially hit billions of people. Now, again, most of the scams that are out there are numbers games, right? It's phishing with a capital PH, not spear-phishing. So they kind of don't care who they get. They just want to get some hits. Another thing, this is just a postulate. A postulate means something that sounds good and might be good, but it's hard to, rigorously prove. If you've taken geometry, you might vaguely remember something called the parallel postulate, which becomes the basis for different forms of geometry. So I have a postulate that a site, basically any sort of website that is growing very, very quickly is going to be scrambling more to keep up with demand rather than making sure that security is really good, right? Once demand starts to flatten out, then yeah, maybe then you're like, okay, now we kind of got a breather, we can do this. But the early days of Facebook, when it was like doubling every year, it was kind of all they could do just to keep up with that. And yeah, they were trying to do security, but a lot of bad stuff happened. Anyway, so trade-off, like anything we talked before, security is a trade-off, right? Perfect security is impossible, but you need to have some security or everybody's going to get everything. So Facebook has this trade-off. They want to provide a reasonably safe and secure site, but still remaining fast and convenient, right? I mean, they could do deeper checks on everything they're putting in people's feed, but guess what? That's going to mean it's going to take longer to construct people's feed. It's a problem. All right. I have a bunch of cases here. None of these cases are testable. All right. So I'm not going to ask, hey, what happened to Facebook in 2011, right? These are here. These are in normal times, I would talk about these and I would say, hey, these are some concrete examples of some of the security threats that I've talked about, right? But for now, if you're interested in this stuff, if you're thinking, hey, maybe I want to be an IDS major or I just want to learn more about security because information security is kind of relevant to all of us, right? Go ahead and read them. That's good. I will mention briefly one, this one. So I said brute force attacks are not a severe threat in a well-designed system. Well, in this case, in 2016, Facebook's engineers were working on some new feature, and so they created a simpler backdoor into the system so they could do some testing, right? Basically, they created kind of a parallel entry point into Facebook that still had access to all that same data, but they didn't put in the feature where the account would lock after so many failed attempts. So if the bad guys, for example, had known Mark Zuckerberg's email that he used on Facebook, they could have done a brute force attack on that and probably figured out, they might have had a good chance of hacking it. I don't know, depending on how long it is. But the point is, given enough time, yeah, they absolutely could have done that kind of brute force attack. So fortunately, the guy who found it was not a bad hacker. He was a nice hacker. And he told them, Facebook says, hey, Facebook, I found this vulnerability in your system. And so they gave him some cash. Thank you very much, good sir. And they fixed the vulnerability. All I'm saying, though, even if the base system is fine, there's always changes going on to systems, always things happening, and there's always the possibility that somebody might slip up and miss a spot. All right. Some other things, too, if you're interested in some of those. But I'm going to skip ahead. So, attacker motivations. Who are attackers? Well, the vast majority of them are the first two categories, either government organizations, military and espionage, or criminal organizations, looking to make money. On occasion, you will find the lone oddball with, who's bored or has a personal grudge of some kind. But the first two are by far the most common cases. And the question is, why launch attacks? Why are these people doing this stuff? Well, in most cases, it's to steal intrinsically valuable information. So if you think about, some military espionage organization, they're trying to find out stuff about other countries' armed forces or, new weapons in design or, the layout of some military base, stuff like that. They might also, criminal operations, they might also be doing blackmail, right? And espionage too. For example, you blackmail some top general in your organization, and then you think, we can get information out of him. Popular one these days is ransomware, right? So ransom to restore usability. Basically, people visit some infected site. There's some sort of cross-site scripting there. What the cross-site scripting does is tamper with the file registry on the machine so everything is locked up and inaccessible. And then they show you that big red screen that you're like, oh shit, it's all over. And they say something like, give us 10 grand in Bitcoin if you ever want to get your data again. Now, I've seen this happen to individuals. Many years, it was about 15 years ago, my then girlfriend's brother must have visited some sketchy site and had this happen to him, and I had to dig around in the registry and fix it. This was the one I dealt with was kind of a crafty one because it also blocked Google. So you couldn't just go on and Google how to do stuff, but they had to keep the online feature availability so you could actually send them Bitcoin. So I used my machine to Google how to do it, and I was like, found the pieces, got rid of them. I think he was okay. But ransomware is a big thing lately. You guys might have heard that the National Health Service in the UK got hit by one of those a few years ago, basically shut down a lot of their stuff. And there have been various municipalities, all over the world that are getting hit by these kind of attacks. So, of course, attackers might try to influence policy or some kind of site operation. So North Korea, they hit Sony trying to get that movie not released. I think it was around 2010, the Chinese government, Chinese espionage agency, actually attacked Google, trying to modify some of Google's source code algorithms to prevent articles critical of the Chinese government from appearing in searches in China, for example. So there was that, and of course, personal. So there was a site, I heard it's back now, Ashley Madison, which was like a dating site for people who were married to hook up with other people who were married, not to each other. You may have heard of it. Anyway, so some dude basically hacked Ashley Madison and published a long list of everybody who had an account there, which probably ended quite a few marriages, but whatever. But it's been speculated that the hacker himself was motivated out of revenge, that he was the victim of some kind of adultery through Ashley Madison. He's like, I'll show you bastards. So there's that. Anyway, a couple more slides, and then we'll talk about the exam. So aggregate damage, depending on who you ask, you might get very, very different numbers. So the first one, about 7 billion in actual damage. That's the actual damage caused by hackers in terms of value of data stolen and costs of remediation, basically fixing the problem. If you look at bigger numbers, like the total cost of attacks and prevention, then globally it's getting closer to $1 trillion or even trillions. The difference is who you ask, right? So this is not specific to security or Facebook. This is just in general. If somebody shows you a big scary number, you can fairly ask, why is your number so big and scary? Is it the actual truth, or are you trying to push my opinion some way? And if you look at who gives you the 6 trillion number, right? So it's over 4 years, but it's like substantially bigger than that other one. You'll see that the name of the organization, Cybersecurity Ventures, they're trying to sell businesses security services. So of course they want to give you the most terrifying number possible. And they want to make you think that everybody in the world is spending bags and bags of money on that, and you should too, with them. Just saying. I'm not saying they're any kind of bad organization. I'm saying if Cybersecurity Ventures leads with there's 7 billion in, US damage, people are going to kind of yawn, right? But if you say 1.7, 2 trillion a year, they'll be like, ooh, shit. Okay. That's all. Now, as far as organizational security, employees are the most common breach point. Most of the time, the security measures in place work pretty well. As far as, automated stuff, it's when employees do something they shouldn't, right? They go to a sketchy website, they download that attachment, right? They install an application that wasn't authorized. Things like that are responsible for the vast majority of security problems in organizations. So organizations basically need to keep an eye on what employees are doing, right? Have clear policies, train the employees, monitor that they're actually doing what they're supposed to do and not doing what they're not supposed to do, stuff like that. And periodically, they need to do risk assessments, like do some kind of test scenarios. That's one of the things they do here at UIC if you're an employee. Periodically, they'll say, okay, this quarter we're going to do some security stuff, and we're going to try to send out phishing emails and see if we can catch any of you with them. And if you do get caught by one of the phishing emails, then of course you are cordially invited to, an hour-long security refresher session. So, yeah. Okay. Now, as far as individual security, what you can do as an employee and not torpedo your career in the first couple months of being on the job. Number one, don't install unauthorized software, right? If they say don't do it, then don't do it. Keep your passwords strong. Keep your antivirus tools active. Don't shut them off to make stuff work faster. And when you get security updates, set as the default setting, install them immediately, even though it's kind of an inconvenience, right? We've all had that thing where we want to do some web browsing for whatever, and it's all of a sudden everything kind of stops because our security feature uploads. They're like pulling down this massive batch of data and we kind of can't do anything else for a minute. But yeah, in business setting, that's certainly more important. Be alert to suspicious emails. Right? If they look sketchy, they probably are. Even if they don't look sketchy, they might be. If you have any important documents, regularly back them up, right? Google Drive or something like that. Now, you may be limited in doing that with organizational stuff. There may be policies on where it can go. But as far as your personal stuff, yeah, if your machine gets hit with ransomware, you don't want to lose, everything. And finally, if you have any concerns, please forward them to your security contact. For example, if you get a notification from UIC that says, hey, it's that time of year again, time to update your password, and you just updated your password last month, you might say, that seems suspect. So maybe give them send the actual security people an email. Okay. And that's it. That's all I got for that. So we have a little bit of time for Q&A if people have them. But before we start, I want to mention a couple things. So if people have Q&A, that's great, and I'm happy to talk. But one thing, a question I often get the question, how can I do well or better on exams, right? And it is unfortunate that the question I get much more often than that is, how can I get extra credit after not doing well on the exams, right? This is the one you want to start with. And the answer is simple stuff. Show up for lectures, and hey, you're all here, so that's great. Pay attention and think about the material while I'm presenting it. Okay, that's obvious stuff. Don't Facebook or daydream about Susie or Chad or Susie and Chad, if that's your thing. Not going to judge. Okay. And if you have questions, please ask. Okay. So that's the simple stuff. As far as the exam itself, remember, for any topic or concept in the TOI, the topics of interest, think about what the term or concept is, so you recognize what it means when you see it, and some of the questions will basically just assess that. Number two, how the thing or concept is used and why it is used that way. Okay, that's the stuff. So, sample question. Everybody wants a sample question, right? Sure, of course you do. So, sample question from this morning was, what property of RAM makes it volatile memory? Okay, possible answers. Number one, it is very fast. Or B, it is very slow. Or C, it requires constant power supply. Or D, it does not require constant power supply. Or E, there is no such, oh no, I did a different thing. It quickly becomes obsolete. All right, so in a way, this is asking for the definition of volatile memory, but not in a way that just says, hey, what's volatile mean? So what's the correct answer? C. Yeah, it's C, right? Yeah, okay. Now this is good. This is good that a lot of people got that, because I am always concerned that people seem to want multiple choice questions like this. What property of RAM makes it volatile memory? Or no, what is RAM? And A small flightless bird native to New Zealand. Or B, a type of foot fungus. Or C, a popular manufacturer of refrigeration coils. Or D, fast computer memory. Or E, there is no such thing as RAM. Okay, but the point is, right, some professors on multiple choice exams, they throw in throwaway answers that are so obviously wrong. I don't do that. I'm trying to assess what you know, right? Because pack-back, everybody should get the full points and then some. Lab stuff, homeworks, everybody should get the full points, right? The exams are what distinguish the students who are just showing up and doing the basics to the people who are actually learning the material well. And if you are learning the material well, these exams will not be terribly difficult, I promise. What the complaint I get at the end of the semester is there were a lot of answer options that were similar. And I'm saying, like what I did with RAM there, those only seem really similar if you don't know the material, right? If you don't know the material yet, then you have time to learn it. But I'm saying if you're looking at those and thinking, wow, those are all kind of similar, you got to know the material better. Okay, so I've said everything I want to say. I'm going to reiterate that this exam, if you do badly on it, I will replace the exam score with your other average of your other three exam scores once I get your other three exam scores, okay? But does anyone have any questions for me? Any of the stuff? Yeah.
What's NoSQL versus SQL?
Okay, as databases, when we talk about SQL databases, SQL is the language of databases, right? And NoSQL databases can still use it. But when we talk about SQL databases, we basically mean relational databases. Relational databases are highly structured. They're like what you're doing in Access, right? So you set up database tables where each table has a bunch of records, and every record has the same fields and the same format for those fields. NoSQL databases, and in general, relational databases conform to ACID properties to make sure that you always get the correct answer from the database. NoSQL databases, in a variety of ways, cut some of those requirements down, right? Typically for things like, again, either more efficient storage, because if you require all fields to be exactly the same size, there's going to be some dead space in them, right? So you can maybe pack together documents tighter if you need to. Other things you might do, you might design a NoSQL system that runs faster but doesn't 100% follow ACID properties, because in a big system, ACID properties can slow it down too much. Okay, so there's one kind of relational database. They basically all follow that. They basically all follow ACID properties. There are many kinds of SQL databases because there's a lot of different corners that you can cut. Okay, other stuff. All right, going once. Going twice. All right. Enjoy the time, exam on Friday. I'll see you then.